expected my home to be just as I had left it a few days ago, with the comforting hum of familiarity and the faint scent of tea in the kitchen. I had driven upstate to visit Ruth, an old friend who still knew me before life got complicated, before Daniel got married, before Mara began subtly reshaping our world. It was a quiet trip, nothing dramatic, just a chance to breathe, share memories, and maybe laugh a little. When I returned, though, I found something I was not prepared for. The porch light wasn't on. The house was silent, and then my eyes caught sight of the unthinkable. My life, my belongings, carefully boxed or casually thrown outside, as though I had never belonged there at all. My old lamp lay on its side near the door. My suitcase leaned against the bushes, half unzipped, a framed photo of Daniel and me. One of the few snapshots I had of the two of us together during his college graduation had a folded note taped to it. I unfolded it slowly, my fingers trembling. Daniel's handwriting stared back at me in bold, deliberate letters. "Mom, sorry. No space for you here anymore. No punctuation. No signature. Just 12 merciless words." I stood rooted to the spot for what felt like hours. I didn't cry. I didn't knock. There was nothing to say. My home, the place that had cradled so many memories, the laughter, the tears, the late-night talks, the holidays, had been quietly claimed by Mara. My son, the boy I had nurtured and loved beyond reason, had silently consented. I lifted my suitcase, gently placed the photos inside, tucked the lamp under my arm, and walked away. I didn't look back. The silence behind me was heavier than any argument could have been. As I reached the corner of the street, I stopped and glanced over my shoulder. The porch remained dark, a hollow echo of the home I had built. That first night, I wandered aimlessly until I reached the community garden a few blocks away. It wasn't comfortable, far from it, but it offered a kind of sanctuary. Years ago, Daniel and I had planted herbs, trimmed small trees, and built a compost bin here. This garden had always held fragments of our shared life, a quiet testament to simpler times. I sat on a worn wooden bench, wrapped in my shawl, staring at the faintly rustling leaves. Morning arrived in a muted gray haze. I didn't know where to go, so I simply walked, letting my legs guide me through the familiar streets of our neighborhood. Eventually, I found myself near a row of townhouses I had seen Daniel and Mara visit months before, discussing a possible move. My heart sank as I noticed them through the window, Mara laughing, Daniel nodding with that weary, polite smile he always wore when he wanted to avoid confrontation. Mara held up a glossy brochure, presumably for a new home, her excitement palpable. Daniel didn't look at me, or perhaps he did, but it was the ghost of recognition, not acknowledgement. It hit me then. The pieces of the past few months fell into place with painful clarity. Mara taking control of the bills, Daniel avoiding discussions about the house. Letters addressed to him, but sent to our address. subtle hesitations and strange omissions. I had ignored the signs, or perhaps I had chosen not to see them. I left them behind without confrontation, walking farther than I had planned, until I reached the edge of the lake near the public library. The water was still, mirroring my thoughts. For the first time since discovering that note, I felt the sting of recognition, not just betrayal, but deliberate erasure. By mid-morning, I wandered into the library, not for books, but for quiet and a place to recharge my phone. Evelyn Hart, the woman who had been erased in her own home, needed clarity. And that's when I ran into Martina Wilkes, an old colleague from my insurance consulting days. Sharp, intelligent, and perceptive, she could see the edges of a story before the words were spoken. She offered coffee and a sympathetic ear. As I explained little, just enough, she leaned in, serious and unwavering. She reminded me of a case she had handled years ago, a story eerily similar to my own. A daughter-in-law quietly seizing control, erasing the mother from the home and from official records. She offered guidance and promised to help me navigate the legal labyrinth I had unknowingly entered. Her calm authority grounded me. For the first time since leaving my home, I felt that flicker of possibility, a hint that the situation could be reversed, that justice could be restored. Later that day, I rented a small post office box, a precaution, a signal to myself that I was reclaiming something, a place in the world that Mara and Daniel could not touch. I watched the evening light stretch across the sidewalk outside, feeling a new clarity emerge. The storm hadn't passed, but for the first time, I was facing it on my own terms. That night, sitting in the quiet of the library parking lot, I thought of my house, of my son, of Mara. They had taken my silence for granted, but I would not be silent anymore. I would return. I would reclaim not just my home, but my life. The morning after I slept on that bench near the community garden, I walked with no particular destination, only a heavy awareness that my life had been quietly rewritten without my consent. My phone buzzed to life with a single missed call from Daniel, time-stamped late the night before. No voicemail, no explanation, just his name staring back at me. I stared at it too, feeling the sting of absence, and then slid it into my pocket. He hadn't tried to follow up. He hadn't reached out to check if I was okay. That silence, I realized, was deliberate. I wandered toward the public library, seeking not only quiet, but access to power outlets. My trip upstate hadn't required me to charge my phone, and I had left home assuming I would return to familiar walls and electricity. That assumption, like so many others, had been shattered. I found a quiet corner near the window, plugged in my phone, and waited for it to hum back to life. It was then that I saw Martina Wilkes again. She approached with that familiar confidence, sharp yet tempered by decades of experience. We hadn't spoken in years, but she recognized the tension in my posture immediately. After greetings and brief small talk, she asked what brought me to town. I hesitated, offering only a vague answer, just passing time. But she read the truth on my face. My home had been stolen from me, piece by piece, and I had only just realized the full extent. Martina offered a simple question, but it landed like a hammer. Do you have access to the house title? I paused. I used to, I said softly, my voice almost swallowed by the library's quiet. She leaned in, her eyes sharp. Double check. Sometimes people assume ownership or authority that isn't theirs. I've seen cases where daughters-in-law or sons quietly manipulate documents, move a parent into assisted living, and flip the property in under 6 weeks. Recognition crept into my chest like a slow, cold wave. My mind raced through the subtle signs I had ignored. Mara offering to manage the water bills. Daniel forgetting to hand me the insurance notices. Letters arriving addressed to him, but sent to our shared address. The moments I had brushed off as coincidence or carelessness weren't mistakes. They were a carefully choreographed erasure. Martina offered to help. She still consulted part-time for women, navigating complex family dynamics and property disputes. You're not alone, she said, and you don't have to figure this out by yourself. I felt a fragile hope bloom. Later that afternoon, I went to the post office and rented a small box. Evelyn Hart, erased from her own home, would now have a place for correspondence, a point of control. The metal drawer felt cold and unassuming, but I already imagined it as a lifeline, a way to reclaim pieces of my life that Mara and Daniel had tried to erase. I spent hours that evening at the bench in the garden again, watching the sun stretch across the city sidewalks. The stillness of the early evening air grounded me in a clarity I hadn't felt since opening that first note on my doorstep. The storm wasn't over, but I could face it now. Not with anger, but with resolve. Not as a passive observer, but as someone who had a claim, legal, moral, and emotional, to fight for what was hers. The next morning, I returned to my old studio above the bookstore, the small space I had kept as a retreat since Richard passed. Dust lingered in corners, mixed with the faint scent of lemon oil, and dried lavender from a sash I had tucked away years ago. I ran my fingers along the edge of my old desk, touched the spines of books that had guided me through late-night consulting work. And then I found it, the proof I needed. The original deed, the notarized copy of the title, all of it still in my name. Daniel had never been mentioned, never added, never discussed. A co-ownership agreement Richard and I had drawn up explicitly stated that if one of us passed, the other retained full rights. My son had not been granted authority. Mara had quietly assumed it. I flipped through bills and utility notices I had kept out of habit. Water, electricity, trash, everything now addressed to Mara. A copy of a utility request with a forged signature sat on top of the pile. I could tell immediately that it wasn't mine. The message was clear. They had already begun replacing me, not just in the house, but on paper, as though I had never existed. I did not cry. Instead, I acted. I placed the deeds, the co-ownership agreement, a copy of my ID, and my last tax return, everything that proved the house belonged to me, into the small fireproof safe I kept under my desk. I locked it carefully, deliberately. This was no longer just about reclaiming a home. It was about reclaiming my place in the world, the part of myself that had been quietly cut away. Later, Martina called. She asked for all the documents I had collected and promised to help coordinate with a trusted estate attorney. By the end of the day, my plans were taking shape. Formal cease and desist letters, notifications to the county clerk's office, protective flags on the title, and meticulous documentation of every forged signature and misdirected bill. They might have assumed my silence meant compliance, but they had underestimated me. That night, I walked home slowly, the city quiet and forgiving in the afterglow of sunset. I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: control. The storm hadn't passed, but for the first time, I had the tools and the clarity to face it. I would not be erased. Evelyn Hart was still here, and she would be heard. The morning sun poured across the sidewalks, softening the sharp edges of my thoughts. I walked to Martina's office with my briefcase tucked tightly under my arm. My resolve had solidified overnight like concrete setting in the chill of winter. Every step toward that door reminded me that this wasn't just about a house. It was about everything I had built, every memory I had nurtured, every part of myself that had been quietly pushed aside. Martina greeted me with that same unshakable calm. She had already scanned the documents I had left the day before. Her eyes, always so discerning, flicked over my expression before returning to the paperwork. Daniel and Mara are moving fast, she said. They're testing boundaries. We need to close them down before they overreach. I nodded, taking a deep breath. I want every step documented, I said. No room for ambiguity. If they try to claim anything, I want proof ready. Martina gave a small smile, one that carried years of experience and quiet reassurance. You'll have it, she said. I'll handle the channels. You just focus on being present, being deliberate. Let's start with Ashby Sterling. By mid-morning, I was seated across from Ashby in her tidy office, the scent of polished wood and soft leather filling the air. Ashby was older than I had expected, with silver hair cropped neatly, but she carried herself with the kind of confidence that required no introduction. I handed her everything: the original deed, the notarized copies, utility bills, and the forged requests. Her eyes scanned each page slowly, deliberately, as if weighing the significance of every line, every signature, every omission. None of this changes the fact, she said finally, her voice steady, that you are the sole legal owner of this property. The attempts to redirect utilities, the forged forms, the digital submissions, they are circumstantial, but they do not constitute lawful transfer. if they try to leverage these actions in a sale or refinance, it becomes fraud. I exhaled, feeling the tension leave my shoulders in one long, slow wave. The coldness I had carried for days, the weight of betrayal, began to lift slightly. I realized that clarity, not anger, would be my weapon. Ashby walked me through the next steps, a formal cease and desist letter to both Daniel and Mara, notifications to the county clerk, a soft restriction on the property that would flag any unauthorized transactions. Every measure was precise, deliberate, surgical. The law, I realized, could be my shield if wielded properly. Martina arranged for a courier to deliver the sealed envelopes, one to Daniel's office, one to Mara's workplace, and one to the county office. Each was documented, notarized, and accounted for. There would be no mistakes, no gaps for them to exploit. As we left Ashby's office, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: steadiness. The storm wasn't over, but I was no longer adrift in it. For the first time, I felt like a participant in my own life, not a spectator watching as it was rewritten around me. The following days passed in a quiet rhythm of checks and confirmations. No calls from Daniel or Mara, no messages, no confrontations. And then, one quiet Wednesday afternoon, my phone rang. Daniel's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring. Then it rang again, and again. By the sixth attempt, a message finally arrived from Mara. "You didn't have to go this far." I read it carefully, feeling neither anger nor the desire to reply immediately. Later that night, I sent a single line. "Everything has a reason. So does this." It was enough. The silence afterward was louder than any explanation I could have given. The next morning, I returned to the neighborhood near my old home, passing the garden where I had once spent afternoons with Daniel when he was a child. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. The backyard, the house itself, had become irrelevant. What mattered now was the clarity I carried with me. Martina called, reporting that Daniel had emailed her firm, asking if the documents I had submitted were valid. Ashby confirmed everything, giving independent verification. There was no confrontation, no shouting, just the quiet power of facts on my side. And then Daniel appeared at my studio. He didn't knock. He simply waited until I opened the door, eyes tired and guarded, a mixture of confusion and fear flickering across his face. He wanted to talk. I stepped aside, letting him into the space without inviting him fully into my world. He spoke in hurried fragments, explaining that Mara had taken the lead because she assumed I needed rest, that nothing was meant to escalate, that it was all a misunderstanding. I didn't interrupt. I let him fill the room with his excuses, the air heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, I asked one question, simple, calm, but loaded with everything I had felt since the first note appeared on my doorstep. "Why didn't you stop her?" His eyes fell to the floor. "Because I didn't want conflict," he admitted softly. It felt easier to step back than to confront her. I didn't think you'd push back. Cowardice, not cruelty. That was the truth I had been searching for. He had chosen comfort over courage. And in that moment, I realized something deeper. The betrayal was not in Mara's actions alone, but in Daniel's silence. I told him about the letters, the restrictions, the notifications, the proof that had reclaimed what was mine. There was no triumph in my voice, no satisfaction, only clarity. The house could no longer be manipulated. My ownership could not be questioned. He left without further argument. I closed the door behind him, the weight of the encounter settling into a steady, quiet resolve. No anger, no bitterness, only a firm understanding of the truth. I had been erased, yes, but I had written myself back in. That night, I sat by the window in my studio, letting the city lights blur into the distance. I thought of the years I had spent nurturing my home, raising Daniel, caring for every corner of my life. And now I realized I could begin anew. The storm had tested me, but it had also reminded me who I was. The morning light came slowly through the tall studio windows, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. I sat at the edge of my worn wooden desk, a cup of lukewarm tea steaming in my hands, staring at the stack of papers Ashby and Martina had helped me organize. Each document felt like a small victory, a tangible piece of the life I had refused to let be stolen. I realized that in the weeks since I had found that note on my doorstep, I had been moving almost blindly, letting instinct guide me through betrayal and anger. Now, for the first time, I felt deliberate, purposeful, like the architect of my own reclamation. Martina arrived just after mid-morning, carrying a bag of pastries and her usual calm presence. She sat across from me, eyes flicking over the paperwork once more before she opened her mouth. "You've done well," she said simply. "Every precaution, every letter, every alert, everything is airtight. If they try anything now, there will be no loopholes." I let out a slow breath, leaning back in the chair. "It feels different now," I admitted, "like I can finally look at the situation clearly, without the haze of betrayal clouding my judgment. But there's still something in my chest, a tightness, the feeling that it isn't over." Martina nodded knowingly. "That tightness is awareness. You're standing in a space they thought was abandoned. They'll test it, but you won't falter this time." Later that afternoon, I found myself walking the streets near my old neighborhood, not to confront, not to spy, but simply to witness. The familiar sidewalks, the houses with their neat lawns, the maple trees lining the street, all of it felt strangely alien now, as if I were seeing my life through a lens that had never been cleaned before. And there it was again. The house, white shutters, red door, the planter box I had carefully tended in spring. But it wasn't mine anymore, not in the sense I had once believed. They were inside, moving with ease, pretending that life had gone uninterrupted. I didn't stop. I didn't knock. I simply walked past, letting the sight of them go unacknowledged. I realized then that ownership wasn't just about keys or deeds. It was about presence, about the courage to exist fully in a space, even when others tried to diminish you. Returning to the studio, I spread out everything Ashby had prepared for me. Copies of the deed, notarized agreements, cease and desist letters, documentation of forged signatures. Each piece was a shield, each signature a line of defense. I could feel the weight of it in my hands, a steady reassurance that the legal ground beneath me was secure. But more than that, it was symbolic. I had been replaced, yes, but I had reclaimed not only my home, but also my agency. Martina leaned over the desk. "You should consider what comes next," she said gently. "The house is protected, but this isn't just about property. It's about what you want for yourself, for the years ahead." I thought about that. For years, my life had been entwined with the house, with Daniel, with the routines and obligations that kept me tethered. And now, for the first time, I could make a choice unburdened by expectation. I could step forward deliberately, not as someone defending what had been taken, but as someone defining what remained mine. That evening, I returned to the post office to finalize the P.O. box I had rented earlier. It wasn't glamorous, not even comforting, but it was a symbol of my self-reliance, a place where my name could exist without interference, where letters, documents, and messages could arrive safely without being intercepted or misused. I carried the box key in my pocket like a talisman, a small but meaningful marker of autonomy. As the week progressed, I focused on subtle, deliberate actions. Martina helped me track every digital and physical move related to the property. Ashby filed notifications with the neighborhood council, informing them that any transaction involving my property required direct authorization from me. I began documenting every interaction, every potential attempt at manipulation, compiling a quiet, meticulous record of my presence and authority. One afternoon, while organizing my papers, I stumbled upon the framed photograph of Daniel's college graduation. I hadn't looked at it in months. In the corner of the frame, I noticed something I hadn't before. My own image had been carefully trimmed away, as if someone wanted to erase the evidence that I had once stood there. The realization should have made me angry, but instead, I felt a profound sense of recognition. Someone had tried to remove me, but the act itself confirmed my importance. I placed the photograph in a cloth pouch and tucked it away in a wooden box in my closet, along with small mementos of my past. Daniel's ribbon from a spelling bee, old keys, and letters. Each item was a reminder that memory and experience cannot be forged or stolen. They exist independently of documents and signatures, independently of others' attempts to rewrite history. By the end of the week, I felt a shift inside me. The storm of betrayal and anger had settled into something quieter, steadier, clarity. I had been erased on paper, yes, but I had written myself back in. My presence, my voice, and my decisions were intact. And for the first time in years, I could breathe without hesitation. That evening, as I walked home from the studio, the city lights reflecting in the puddles on the street, I realized that reclaiming control was not about confrontation or victory. It was about presence, about standing fully in the space I occupied in my own life without fear or apology. I had survived being erased, and now I existed fully, deliberately, unapologetically. By the following Wednesday, I felt an unfamiliar steadiness settling into my bones. Weeks of uncertainty, sleepless nights on park benches, and painstaking organization of documents had finally begun to yield a sense of control. Ashby and Martina had done their work efficiently, quietly, and thoroughly. Every deed, every notarized agreement, every flagged document in the county system was a line of defense, a silent affirmation that I still existed in this world, not as a shadow or an afterthought, but as a woman who had refused to be erased. I remember the moment I realized how different I felt now. It was a gray, drizzly morning, and I had just left Martina's office, the bag with copies of documents tucked securely under my arm. Normally, I would have felt a pang of anxiety walking past my old neighborhood, but this time it was different. I didn't hesitate, didn't glance at the house. I walked past with a sense of quiet authority. I was aware of my past there, aware of the memories, but I was no longer hostage to them. Ownership, I understood, wasn't about walls or keys. It was about presence and agency. Later that day, my phone rang. Brendan's name flashed on the screen. My heart didn't leap. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I let it ring out. A second call came minutes later, and then a third. I didn't panic. I had learned that urgency from them didn't equate to importance for me. Finally, a message from Kayla appeared, short and pointed. "You didn't have to go this far." I stared at the words, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I sent a single line that night. "Everything has a reason. So does this." The next morning, I walked near the park where I used to take Daniel when he was a boy. The garden, the swings, the little stone wall by the lake, they all reminded me of the life I had shared with him, the years I had poured into raising him. I didn't approach the house. I didn't need to. The act of walking, of being in the space around it without entering, was a quiet reclaiming. I was no longer bound to their version of reality. I was observing, analyzing, preparing. Martina called mid-morning, her voice calm but urgent. Brendan had emailed her firm, asking if the documents I had filed were valid. Ashby had responded professionally, confirming every piece of paperwork and alert. There was no threat, no escalation, just clarity. Brendan couldn't move forward without my acknowledgement, and I had ensured it would remain that way. By afternoon, I found myself at the studio, seated across from Martina, watching her scan every document again. the pile was impressive. Cease and desist letters, notarized deeds, records of forged signatures. But it wasn't just paperwork. It was proof of my vigilance, my refusal to be passive, and my understanding that silence had once been their greatest advantage. Now my silence was deliberate, chosen, and backed by law. Ashby arrived the following day, calm and composed as always. I handed her everything once more: the original deed, copies of the joint ownership agreement, utility bills showing the fraudulent changes, and notarized alerts filed with the neighborhood council. She examined each item meticulously, her expression steady, her presence commanding without demanding. None of this changes the fact that you remain the sole legal owner, she said finally. Attempts to manipulate ownership are circumstantial until challenged. If they try to leverage any transaction, it becomes outright fraud. You're protected. Hearing her words, I felt a lightness I hadn't known in months. The documents weren't just shields, they were affirmation. They represented the life I had built, the years of care, effort, and love I had poured into my home, now safeguarded against their quiet erasure. Later that week, I received the invitation from Brendan. We're having a family discussion Saturday. Hope you can come. It's time to clear the air. I didn't respond immediately. I forwarded the message to Ashby. Her reply was swift. Let me come with you, just in case. That settled it. I wasn't going alone, not because I feared confrontation, but because I had learned that presence alone was not enough. Preparedness was power. Saturday arrived gray and chilly, the kind of wind that seeped into your bones and reminded you that comfort was often secondary to purpose. Ashby picked me up in her sensible navy sedan. She had her briefcase, calm presence, and a copy of every letter and document. The drive was quiet, the city moving past us obliviously, unaware of the quiet storm I was about to confront. Standing on the porch of my old home, I noticed the meticulous staging. Cushions fluffed, candles burning, a cheese board set as if for a photograph. Kayla's smile stretched too wide, overly practiced. Brendan's handshake was firm, but his eyes darted nervously between Ashby and me. They were ready, yes, but they didn't know the depth of my preparedness. Kayla spoke first, smooth and polished, attempting control. We know there's been tension. We wanted an open, respectful dialogue. This is still your home, too, she said, gesturing to the living room. Ashby quietly set the cease and desist letter on the table. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Actually, Ashby said evenly, this home belongs solely to my client, Evelyn Carter. She remains the legal owner. Any claims otherwise have been formally challenged and recorded. This is not a discussion. This is confirmation. The room fell silent. Brendan paled, Kayla blinked, and I watched the cracks in their carefully constructed confidence. Ashby continued, we are aware of forged documents submitted to multiple institutions. These filings have been reported and flagged. Further action is pending, but my client reserves the right to press charges if necessary. Kayla's voice dropped an octave. This isn't how we wanted to do things. I looked at her, really looked. For the first time, I saw the fear behind her polished exterior. The realization that their quiet attempt to erase me had been exposed and nullified had unsettled them in ways they hadn't anticipated. Brendan attempted to speak, paused, and then closed his mouth, hands clenched. I stood quietly, deliberately. You tried to write me out of my own life. You thought I wouldn't notice. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice. I simply spoke the truth. Then I turned, leaving the room with Ashby at my side. At the door, she paused. If you attempt to interfere again, legal proceedings will follow immediately. Outside, the wind felt sharp, yes, but cleansing. For the first time in months, I felt something that wasn't anger or hurt. It was clarity. That night, back at my studio, I organized the documents once more, but this time not out of necessity. I did it as a reminder. I had survived erasure, and I had written myself back into existence. Ownership was more than a title. Presence was more than walls. And in that quiet, I knew I had reclaimed not only my home, but my sense of self. The morning after the confrontation, I woke to sunlight spilling across the floor of my studio. It wasn't the light from the living room windows of my old home, framed in memory and regret. It was a quiet, fresh light that felt as if it belonged only to me. For the first time in months, I realized that no one could touch this sense of calm. Not Brendan, not Kayla, not even the memories that lingered like ghosts in the corners of the old house. I was awake in a space of my own making, a space where ownership and presence aligned. I moved slowly, savoring the silence. I didn't turn on the radio, didn't check emails, didn't reach for my phone until I had brewed tea and poured it into my favorite chipped mug. I sat by the window, watching the world wake up. People passed by, some hurried, some leisurely, completely unaware of the storm I had weathered, the near erasure of a life carefully built, and the quiet reclamation of agency that had followed. And yet, I felt connected not to anyone else, but to myself. Over the next few days, I began the practical work of letting go. Selling the house had always felt impossible, but now it felt necessary. I didn't do it out of spite. I didn't do it for revenge. I did it because ownership of a place is as much emotional as it is legal. I no longer wanted walls that had been used as tools to marginalize me, memories that had been weaponized against me, or rooms where my presence had been treated as negotiable. I wanted a clean slate, a quiet space that belonged to no one but me. I started by contacting Ashby and Martina, confirming every step of the sale would be handled discreetly, legally, and efficiently. They were remarkable in their professionalism, their calm insistence on precision. Martina reminded me that I wasn't being aggressive or vengeful. I was merely exercising the rights I had fought to protect. I held onto that thought as I reviewed the documents again. Each signature, each notarization, a line in the story of my reclamation. When the real estate listing went live, I didn't feel the pang of loss I expected. I felt a strange liberation instead. The house would be someone else's now, and that was exactly as it should be. It was no longer my responsibility to carry its history or its ghosts. I felt an unfamiliar sense of peace watching Brendan and Kayla navigate the sale from the sidelines, their movements cautious, hesitant, aware now that their assumptions about control had been decisively challenged. In the evenings, I began to write again. Not legal notes, not documents, but journals, pages of memory and reflection stitched together with quiet observation. I wrote about the house, yes, but also about the silence, the way it could wound or heal depending on who held it. I wrote about betrayal, cowardice, and resilience. And slowly, I began to realize that writing wasn't just an act of remembrance. It was an act of self-preservation. Every line on the page was a way of acknowledging my own presence, a quiet affirmation that I had survived and that I had chosen myself. One morning, while rearranging the small storage cabinet under my desk, I rediscovered a photograph from Brendan's college graduation. Everyone was there. Brendan, Kayla, my sister-in-law from Nebraska. The frame had always been slightly too large for the photo, and I had tucked a pressed daisy in the corner. But this time, I noticed something I hadn't before, or perhaps had refused to see. The edge of the photo, where my presence should have been, had been surgically removed. Not torn, not crumpled, just cleanly cut out. Someone had tried to erase me even from memory. I stared at it for a long time, feeling a quiet recognition rather than shock or sadness. I didn't cry. I didn't throw it away. I placed the photo in a cloth pouch and tucked it into a wooden box in the back of my closet. Alongside it were old keys, ribbons from Brendan's childhood spelling bees, and a crayon drawing from his own child. It was a box of history, memory, and love, but it was mine. I closed it gently, feeling the stillness settle around me. Around this time, I began planting lavender on the windowsill of my studio. The first blooms were uneven, crooked, leaning toward the sun, as if they too were reclaiming their space. Each morning, I watered them carefully, watched the growth, and allowed myself to feel a quiet satisfaction. Life, like lavender, grows best when tended with patience, not force. I realized that I, too, was leaning toward my own light, finding strength in the simple act of daily care. Martina visited occasionally, bringing pastries and news of early donations to the foundation I had established for women over 60 who had been manipulated, silenced, or discarded by their families. The letters that began trickling in were small, humble, yet profoundly moving. One arrived from a woman in Utah who had read about the fund in a church newsletter. "Thank you for existing." I read it twice, I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a folder I kept for reminders of why reclaiming my life mattered. The old house had officially sold. Brendan and Kayla had moved out, and their absence was now a quiet testament to the choices they had made. I didn't expect apologies. I didn't expect understanding, but I did expect movement. And in the spaces they left behind, I began to flourish. I walked each morning, brewed tea, wrote, and tended to the small rituals of daily life. The silence was no longer a weapon. It was a companion, a space for reflection and clarity. I understood finally that healing wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't arrive with announcements or grand gestures. It came quietly, like breath, slow and steady, reshaping everything from the inside. I had not erased Brendan or Kayla from memory. I simply chose not to center my life around people who had edited me out of theirs. In that quiet, I discovered something stronger than grief, stronger than anger. I discovered myself after the sale of the house. Life settled into a rhythm I hadn't known in years. For so long, my days had been punctuated by responsibilities that weren't fully mine, monitoring bills, mediating arguments, managing spaces that were supposed to be shared. Now, each morning, I woke to a quiet apartment filled only with things I had chosen, objects that reflected me, and a sunlight that seemed to recognize my presence. I felt an unfamiliar, liberating kind of ownership, not just of property, but of myself. I started my mornings the same way, tea in hand, notebook open, lavender on the sill. I wrote a little every day, sometimes about mundane things, sometimes about memories that surfaced uninvited. Writing felt like reclaiming moments that had been stolen from me by silence and omission. I wrote about the early mornings with Brendan when he was small, the afternoons spent in the garden, the long evenings reading beside Richard after he passed. All of it was mine, and I could honor it without interference. Martina continued to visit, though not as frequently. She'd bring pastries, sometimes news of the foundation's growth, sometimes just conversation about life, politics, or books. Her presence was reassuring, a reminder that support doesn't have to come with conditions. Ashby checked in remotely, guiding me through the final paperwork for the foundation, helping me structure it for long-term sustainability. Together, they had become my quiet allies in a world that had once felt alien and hostile. I dedicated more time to the foundation itself, a space I had created not in anger, but from clarity. I wanted it to be a real resource for women who had been silenced or pushed aside. I drafted newsletters, contacted legal advisors, and began building a small network of volunteers. Every letter, every inquiry, every donation, no matter how small, reminded me that the world still had room for kindness and justice. It was a subtle, persistent form of empowerment, one I hadn't known I could feel so deeply. Some afternoons, I walked through the city slowly, without purpose or destination. I stopped at cafes, watched people pass, and allowed myself to simply exist in public spaces without expectation. It was liberating. The world hadn't changed, but my place in it had. I no longer needed to navigate the silent battles of a household where my presence was negotiable. I was no longer invisible. I was present, and that presence mattered. Occasionally, thoughts of Brendan and Kayla surfaced, though less sharply than before. I remembered Brendan's hesitant apologies, Kayla's carefully orchestrated smiles, and the calculated attempts to erase me. At first, these memories were sharp, like splinters under the skin. Over time, however, they became softer, more like echoes. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want confrontation. I simply wanted peace. I wanted a life where my energy was spent